You're tuned in to Women in America, the podcast that dives deep into the issues shaping gender equality in the U.S. and beyond. Hosted by Pari and Eve, public health professionals by day, content creators by passion, we bring you expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable strategies to push the fight for equality forward. This season, Rights at the Crossroads unpacks the intersections of reproductive rights and gender justice in today's America.
On this episode of Women in America, we're joined by lawyer Rachel Cohen, who shares her expertise to brief us on the decisions that the Supreme Court dropped and rocked the nation with on their last day in session. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, I am joined today by a really special guest. Her name is Rachel Cohen, and I have to tell you, my first experience of Rachel was actually on my TikTok FYP. She popped up talking about some shady shit that was going down with the law firms in the US, and she is a lawyer herself. And so it's pretty surreal of me to take like my FYP and now turn it into real life because I'm sitting down with her today. So Rachel, why don't you share with the folks what you're about?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Pari. And it's nice to be talking individually. We've obviously been at a couple of similar conferences and events and in some group messages, and I'm looking forward to a one-on-one conversation. But that existence of that video and kind of everything that came from it happened about 3 months ago, 3.5 at this point. And since I guess the video itself was about my former employer, which is a large corporate law firm called SCOTUS, but not really just about them, but about the industry broadly and Donald Trump attacking large corporate law firms in an attempt of kind of controlling the legal industry and preventing certain cases from being brought, usually those that challenge him, and also just like some vindictive bullshit that had to do with him being upset about things that happened in his last term. Mm-hmm. And that went I don't even know. It's weird to call it very viral because it's more just like it impacted my life very dramatically. I was posting a series of those videos while I was still employed at Skadden and then ultimately ended up resigning. And that resignation letter I read on TikTok and got really large as well. So since then, I have been just doing a lot of awareness campaigns related to the Trump administration's kind of attacks on the legal industry, on the judiciary, etc. I'm now part-time employed on a consulting basis at a new law firm, and also just doing what I think everyone is doing, which is trying to wrap my head around what on earth is going on in Trump 2.0.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm glad you're here because for folks listening, the Supreme Court of the United States, which we will lovingly call SCOTUS from here on out, has released about 7 or 8 landmark decisions within the last 2 days. And I say last 2 days as in like several of these decisions came out on Friday. And I feel like they're not getting the attention they deserve because 1, there were multiple cases dropped within a few hours of each other. And then 2, the Senate is currently voting on this big bullshit bill that is going to affect like more than 90% of Americans. And so understandably, people's attention is kind of being pulled in multiple directions, right? So Rachel, I'm really glad you're here because I think like it could be a very easy, succinct way for us to sort of review some of the heaviest hitting cases and what they mean for the public moving forward. And then think about like what that means for the future of America. So we're going to pick a few of the cases just to deep dive into them. But there are more. So maybe we'll have Rachel back actually for a part 2 on this. But the first one we're going to start with is the one that everyone has been talking about. So it's the case on birthright, citizenship, and nationwide injunctions. And this was a 6-3 ruling. Now, for folks who are not too familiar with the makeup of the Supreme Court, there are 6 conservative judges and 3 progressive judges. And when I say that, I mean 6 judges who were appointed by Republican presidents initially. And so oftentimes you will see a 6-3 split, except for the occasional instance where Amy Coney Barrett finally remembers that she's also a woman and decides to vote the other way. But Rachel, tell us a little bit about what the birthright citizenship case means and what the ruling stands for.
The birthright citizenship case, so Trump versus CASA, is a complicated one. And it's one where I often feel like I'm doing that lawyering well, actually, when I explain it to people. I've been grateful that a lot of other content creators have been open to having kind of correct them on things that I'm sure feel a little nitpicky. But the reason that we're nitpicking on this case is because it's about birthright citizenship, but the decision doesn't actually touch on birthright citizenship at all. I go back and forth on, holding that up and saying, that means that birthright citizenship still exists because it does. there are also a million different rights and privileges and procedural concerns that technically still exist in this country that the Trump administration is ignoring left and right. So
Yes.
when people are pushing back on a frame of this decision ending birthright citizenship, I want to be very clear that at least for myself, that's not because I think that the Trump administration is following the law. It's because there's a lot of people who are currently pregnant or who recently gave birth or who are birthright citizens, the children of undocumented parents that were born here in this country, that have a lot of questions and concerns about what the case means for their own legal posture and citizenship. And so technically, there is still birthright citizenship in the United States for everyone. There's been some reporting that that's not the case. It is. What this Supreme Court decided to rule on, instead of getting to the birthright citizenship question, which shouldn't be a question at all, is that the lower court judges had used something called a universal injunction, which blocks the Trump administration from implementing its executive order that got rid of birthright citizenship in the entire country while this thing is being litigated. And the reason that they did that, usually in order to get a universal injunction, you need to prove that you're likely to succeed on the merit, like you're likely to win your case, and also that if the policy is allowed to go into effect while the case is being litigated, that there will be, I think the standard is irreparable harm. Obviously, it is irreparable harm to someone who is born while this is being litigated if the Trump administration is saying that there's no such thing as birthright citizenship, right? So it was a very easy injunction to get.
Yeah.
It goes all the way up to the court, and the court says, we don't know about birthright citizenship. We're not addressing that. That's not what's immediately relevant, because in order to answer that question at all, we would have to think that the universal injunction is permissible, and it's not. It's too overbroad. It oversteps the authority of the court system. And there's nothing like this Supreme Court being concerned about the court overstepping its authority, right? And so we get this opinion that says, functionally, don't use universal injunctions anymore.
Yeah.
CASA, the organization that brought the case in the first place on behalf of people who were going to be impacted by the rollback of birthright citizenship, was prepared for this because the argument that took place at the court, you can often tell based off the questions the justices ask and things what they're focused on. And it was very clear they were focused on universal injunctions as opposed to birthright citizenship itself. And so CASA was prepared and already had documents drafted because they filed them that day, that instead of having like a universal injunction, certified a class, basically like set up class action saying, okay, if a universal injunction is overbroad, it's not narrowly tailored enough, we are going to identify this group of people that the injunction should be issued for. And that's just going to be anyone that might need birthright citizenship. And that one of the things that frustrated me with the ruling, the way it was reported, is that because only some states had joined only some states were kind of fighting, like Democratic states were fighting and everything, there was reporting that the executive order went into place in the states that weren't fighting it. That's not really what happened. It could have gone into place, but CASA immediately certified this class action. You're going to see a lot of people certifying classes to get injunctions for everyone who could possibly be impacted. Like there's just going to be a lot of work to narrow who is covered by an injunction. And that will at least carry us through not just on birthright citizenship, but in terms of pretty much all unconstitutional actions being taken by the Trump administration. That's going to be what we see until the next Supreme Court session. And at that point, I think people justifiably will be very concerned about the court extending this ruling and saying now, okay, the classes you're certifying are not narrowly tailored enough coming after class actions, which I believe in his concurrent, Justice Samuel Alito, who's just the worst person alive.
I would argue that Clarence Thomas is much worse than him.
Sam Alito pisses me off perhaps more because he is not intellectually consistent. Like one thing I will give Clarence Thomas credit for is that he has been saying the most batshit things for way longer than it was cool to say batshit things. He was like 20 years ago going and being like, actually, I don't think anyone should have due process. Back when people would say, well, that seems like a crazy thing to say, as opposed to that being a key tenet of the Republican Party's platform.
Yeah.
So he is at least intellectually consistent, whereas Samuel Alito will go from like, you can literally sometimes use, people will come back and like cite Sam Alito in a dissent where he's like, that's just not applicable. And it's like, what do you mean you said that? Like,
Right. Yeah.
but
Okay,
still,
this is
Daniel Alito
actually
has a footnote
no,
that
I
says
love
like,
this. I
no
love this.
happens.
And honestly, I have to give gratitude to you because, like, I don't think I could have ever thought there was a positive thing about Clarence Thomas. And I'm like, oh, look, perspective changed. So thank you, Rachel.
Well, he's literally since the 90s. He's been like, I'm
He's been
just
psycho
not
since the beginning.
convinced.
I mean, yeah, it's so funny because that is actually classically what we as in like public health creators and content creators in the space, in the like democracy spaces, is like one thing about MAGA is that they will just like go with whatever talking point is thrown at them, right? And so I'm like, they are consistent in their insane level of support for insanity. And that is, I guess, Clarence Thomas has been doing that, like you said, since before it was cool. So
No, 100%. And everyone was like, I mean, what a crazy outlier. And now
he's like the norm. He's
there
like
actually, there
average.
was, I think, an article that was literally just focused on Clarence Thomas's long game and like how successful it had been and how he had been like the crazy uncle for his entire career on the Supreme Court. And now in the last 5 years, he is like the leader because he's never wavered
Yeah.
being like a fascist.
Wow. I mean, how far we have fallen, truly. But, going back to what you were saying about how like people are interpreting this case in super different ways and also it's intentionally confusing. I think that is part of the point, right? They are always trying to be intentionally confusing because they want to leave it to situations where even if there isn't legal recourse that someone can take, they want people to just change their behavior out of fear of possible legal recourse, right? Like, and then you have the mainstream media, which is reporting it in a certain way, perhaps not exactly the most intentional ways. And I'm saying this because I want to read to you what the New York Times summarized this birthright citizenship case to be. And the reason I'm going to read it to you is because it's actually not what you just said, right? What you're saying is that like people are not understanding the depth of this. So I am understanding they wrote two summary sentences, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that their first sentence is accurate and the second sentence is not. Okay, so in the first sentence, they say, in a 6-3 ruling, the court said that federal judges have exceeded their power in issuing temporary pauses on President Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That is correct. Okay, now what I think is wrong is the second sentence based on what you just shared with me. The ruling did not address the order's constitutionality, but it would allow Trump to end birthright citizenship in some parts of the country. Say more about that.
So that's exactly the summary that I was thinking of, actually, because that's what they put on their Instagram graphic.
Yes.
And I saw some that at least that pointed to the fact that not all the states challenged it, that it was overbroad, whatever else. But framing it as allowing him to end birthright citizenship is totally incorrect because they said that the Supreme Court said that the injunction was overbroad and that it would need to be more narrowly tailored. And that day, CASA created this class to allow it to be more narrowly tailored because everyone knew that this was coming.
Right.
And so when you run a headline like in birthright citizenship in some parts of the country, that makes people very, very scared. What parts of the country? Who does it end for? What really was ruled was that, especially, I see how you could make the argument if you're a New York Times writer that technically he's been able to end birthright citizenship in places where if CASA hadn't filed their class action, he might have been allowed to end birthright citizenship while it was litigated, whether or not he could end birthright citizenship, which I'm a big cynic. And so I am not 100% convinced that the court will ultimately find that birthright citizenship is a constitutional right, but they really should. Like anyone who remotely believes in the system feels extremely confident that they are not going to hold this executive order to be constitutional. Because it would have to be just unbelievably bad faith arguments to find that Trump could end birthright citizenship through an executive order. And
but if there's some things that the SCOTUS does well, it's bad faith. So
literally, Clarence Thomas has had those written for 40 years. He's been ready.
He's ready. He's like, I have had this. Let me check my history. Like truly just, it's, yeah.
No, literally. He's like, I wrote this dissent years ago. But so saying that
Mm-hmm.
makes it sound like birthright citizenship has ended in certain parts of the country. And that is just objectively untrue. And I think that it's really irresponsible reporting, even if a New York Times reporter could make the argument that it is technically accurate in this exact moment. Birthright citizenship, what is true is that if you don't need to be protected by this injunction. So if you are a citizen or you're not pregnant or anything else, like if the birthright citizenship executive order doesn't impact you, then the injunction no longer covers you. That was the court's whole point, was that and it's stupid. Like they're just trying to make people afraid and they're trying to limit the power of the lower courts that keep blocking Donald Trump's agenda. But what they basically were saying is that there shouldn't be an injunction that blocks the executive order for everyone because most Americans aren't impacted by the executive order. And so it's overbroad.
Right.
And so Donald Trump can end birthright citizenship to the extent that it doesn't impact any, like there's no force behind it while this is litigated. And
Right.
even if CASA had not been ready to go and had that class action ready to go, the way that that infographic read made it seem like they had reached the question of birthright citizenship, even though they say in the first sentence that they didn't. There's no finality to this decision because it is still being litigated. And so it just really, I thought, an irresponsible frame for people that are not attorneys.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting to me is that for folks listening, so Rachel and I are part of a few group chats made up of content creators, right? And we rely on each other for expertise because just like Rachel laid out, there's things happening every day that not necessarily everyone can speak to based on your background. And what I'm thinking, Rachel, while you're talking about this, is if a group of random progressive content creators can get our shit together and get stuff fact checked before we put it out, you'd think the New York Times could do the same thing, right? But it seems that they have no lawyers on their staff who...
No, I think they're literally between Supreme Court reporters and it's showing.
Yeah. Word. Okay, so deep diving into the next ruling. And as a reminder to folks listening, we're only touching on a few because there's so many. But while we have Rachel's expertise, I wanted to also talk about the Supreme Court decision that dropped that relates to transition care for transgender youths. So for folks who need context around this, the state of Tennessee essentially was deciding whether or not transgender minors could be afforded the same level of healthcare that is already afforded to other minors. What I mean when I say that is, for example, if you were assigned male at birth in Tennessee, you can receive testosterone as a minor. But if you were assigned female at birth, you cannot. And so the state was saying that they're going to maintain that division. And the folks who brought this lawsuit against them, which are 3 transgender minors and their families and a few organizations, and literally every sane medical provider in the country is saying, well, actually, gender-affirming care is healthcare and you should be obligated to provide it. And so this case hit the Supreme Court. And in another 6-3 ruling, the court upheld the Tennessee law that is now going to prohibit medical providers from prescribing anything that relates to gender-affirming care, so like puberty delaying medication or hormone therapy, to minors who identify as transgender, saying that it does not violate equal protection principles. Rachel, tell us from like your perspective a little bit more about this case.
I definitely need to read Scrimetti more carefully. Honestly, my roommate she's sitting for the bar and does a lot of LGBTQ litigation and work. And so I often just have her explain these things to me. I kind of farm out the brain trust where I focus on things that I have more expertise on, like migration work, and she will explain those things to me, but is currently studying. So I've not delved into it as much as I would like to, unfortunately. My understanding, again, I think just the big takeaways that are important for people who are directly impacted and important to highlight is that this is specific to children's healthcare. And I know that that doesn't make it at all unproblematic or not devastating, but I think that this, again, kind of back to the birthright citizenship case, we are seeing really major attacks happen on vulnerable groups in this country, and it's terrifying. And I think that sometimes it feels really unproductive to go in and say, but these attacks are limited to specific groups of people. And I think it is worth having those conversations only to the extent that we can do our best to hold people to the lines that they themselves have established. So there are additional, the ACLU, for example, is pointing out that there's another kind of set of arguments that the court did not reach related to parents' rights to make healthcare decisions for their families. In a world where there was logical consistency in the Supreme Court, that would be the type of argument that the court would
have made, yeah,
to support, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the same court that would be very unlikely politically to be on board with, for example, minors having access to abortion care without parental consent. That would say that parents have a right to direct their children's medical care. And so the ruling of the Supreme Court, that argument was made in the briefings of Scrimetti, and the court didn't reach it. And so all of this to say, I go back and forth on the utility of pointing out additional arguments that are available, or of pointing out that the court didn't find that, because I don't think they're operating in good faith. And I understand that people feel really frustrated with the notion of kind of the good faith liberal coming in being like, well, actually, the court, we could make this argument and the court would believe us. I don't think that the court will believe us, but I think it lets us run the clock to make additional arguments and to make them have to say all of the, see their own logic through. And so again, this is not a final nail in the coffin on this case, but I do think that it's very much, or on this issue, but I think people are right to feel as though it is, and we will have to continue to litigate and see where it lands.
Yeah.
I think we know where it will land, but I do just think that it's not totally done yet.
Yeah. To me, the immediate takeaway from Scrimetti is unfortunately not positive at all, right? It's hard to justify that decision. It's hard to assuage any concerns around the fact that this is going to affect the lives of children in Tennessee and possibly even beyond, because now that the Supreme Court has set a precedent, it's possible that other states will try to litigate similarly. But to me, the key points about Scrimetti are the absolute hypocrisy in that decision. Issue was other things, they would have ruled differently, or they would have come at this a different way. I know you were saying that you debate the utility of bringing up other arguments, but I think actually in this case, it is worthwhile to bring up that other argument because it is pointing out exactly what you're saying, is that they're not operating in good faith. The other thing about Scrimetti that everyone knows, because I harp on this so much, I think our listeners are probably tired of me saying this, but it really emphasizes the importance of local elections, truly, genuinely, right? We have so many examples of this, but this is okay, they took the most vulnerable population, the most marginalized group in a state, and took a case all the way to the Supreme Court to try and strip them of the basic human rights that other people of the same age in that state are already afforded. The reason they did that is because the state of Tennessee proposed this law, they took it to multiple courts and then elevated it to the Supreme Court. And the state of Tennessee is made up of elected officials. And so it really is pointing out to me is we need to create change, not just at the presidential level, not just at the judicial level. We need to be creating change at the local level via our votes and our voices, because it truly, the ripple effects that can come from a single person being elected into local office are more than some of us can comprehend until it's in front of us, So that is something that Scrimetti really makes clear to me.
Yeah. And I think it's also, just to build on that point, when we talk about wanting change at the federal level or wherever else, the way that we get good people with national profiles, with experience, to be in positions of power at the federal level is by making sure that we have a pipeline. It's by making sure that there are people who have support and mentorship from progressives at the federal level who are coming up through state and local level elected office, and that it's a necessary step to protecting people from nightmare federal government by having those people in office at the state and local level to pass the things that are protective of people. And it also is a necessary step for when we do eventually hit federal elections that people care a lot about. We can't have a vacuum of progressives that are now, trying to figure out how to spend themselves as a federal candidate if they have experience at the state and local level.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, last one. We're actually gonna, I think, wrap up with some positive news. So not every decision was holy shit, I need to move to another country. The last one we're gonna talk about is the one also actually that is going to transition us into talking about what's happening right now in the Senate, which the Supreme Court released a decision relating to preventative care under the Affordable Care Act, or as Republicans like to call it, Obamacare. Okay, and this one was actually a 6-3 ruling, but not the typical 6. It was one of those few times where 3 of the Republican judges remembered that they are actually human beings and actually give a shit about people. And Amy Coney Barrett was one of them who finally, I guess, remembered that she's a woman. But essentially, the court ruled they rejected a challenge to the Affordable Care Act. Okay, they determined that the law that determines what types of preventative care insurance companies must offer for free is constitutional. And therefore, that preventative care can remain under the Affordable Care Act. Rachel, I know you said that your area of interest and specialization is more around migration, but any like specific things other than what I said people need to know about this case in particular?
I think this is not legal expertise, but just in general, I think that consistently we have seen that I hesitate to call these people more moderate, right? But the non-Thomas Alito branch of the conservatives on the court are really unwilling to touch the ACA beyond where we've already seen that happen. And I think that there are legal commenters who still believe in the intellectual consistency of the court that I'm sure would come up with a lot of reasons for this. But from my perspective, I think that has a lot to do with the unpopularity of rolling back healthcare. I think that's to bring it back to, the big bullshit bill. That's what has really flipped Tom Tillis on these things is the rollback of Medicaid. And I think that it's really hard for the Republican Party to take rights away from people that they have become used to. Especially rights that affect large groups of people, as opposed to targeting particularly vulnerable minorities like the trans community and particularly trans youth. And so I think that the Supreme Court is still treading very lightly in the aftermath of overturning Roe and seeing the damage that it did to people's trust in the institution. And I think that the ACA is going to remain a popular target of Republicans, but I think that it's going to be very challenging to convince this court to take people's health care away.
Well, especially because, exactly as you said, this is something that directly affects the Republican base as well, right? Like that is one of the things that in my line of work, we see that often. Like I obviously work in abortion and reproductive autonomy quite a bit, but we saw this exact thing that you're describing play out when Trump went after IVF, or I should say when the Alabama State Supreme Court went after IVF, right? Their own base revolted. It was literally like Christian white women who for the first time ever stood up for reproductive rights. And of course, in their minds, they were like, oh, this is different than abortion, even though anyone with a single ounce of critical thinking or common sense understands that you literally cannot have IVF without abortion existing. Like those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? But we saw it happen. And within 24 hours of the Alabama State Supreme Court saying IVF, like saying that embryos are people, which would then, of course, hugely criminalize IVF, the Republican Party had a breakdown. Like they had a true meltdown because like everybody was floundering. They didn't know what the talking points were. It was the one time we really saw like a true inconsistency among MAGA folks because they hadn't had enough time to get like their directions, So I think you're absolutely right. It's not just about the size of the group that something's going to affect. It's also about their base. I'm saying this and I'm about to admit that breaks down when we're looking at this big bullshit bill, right? Because right now in the Senate, and I say right now as in like literally at this very minute, currently the vote is scheduled for 6 hours from this conversation. And so it'll probably be voted on by the time this episode goes live. But, we've been in the Capitol all weekend talking to senators and hearing about all of the stuff that's going down. They're proposing $930 billion in cuts to Medicaid, which is like, if you take away almost $1 trillion from Medicaid, it is not just folks on Medicaid that are about to suffer. It is like every aspect of the healthcare system is about to crumble, right? So I've been really having some like very confusing conversations in my head about like why even the Republicans are supporting this bill. I truly don't get it. But yeah, I think you are right in that it is about who it affects. And so we often see Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett like make decisions differently than their typical voting bloc when it comes down to that. But it is interesting that you say like the fallout from Roe, because even I actually started our account in response to Roe being lost. So we've been working in reproductive health and advocacy professionally for 15 years and still are as part of our day jobs. And then we started expand the content and the advocacy account because we realized that the average American is not hearing from reproductive health experts. So they're just hearing this like really intense misinformation and frankly just lies online about abortion and reproductive health. And I don't necessarily know that we've experienced what you're saying. Like, I think that for in our world, the fallout of Roe has been that more and more conservatives are starting to believe that it is actually acceptable to control women's bodies. We feel like there's been a normalization of that kind of approach and talk. So maybe give me a little bit of happy news and tell me that that's actually not what you're seeing.
Well, I mean, I think that it's important to note that every time abortion rights have been on the ballot and the fall of Roe, they have always won.
Yeah.
And I think that it's something that I see pretty consistently in messaging from the Republicans. Not that they're not doing it, they are. But I think that we've seen a real decline in campaigning on the fact that Roe has been overturned, in campaigning on kind of right to life rhetoric. And that is a totally separate thing from the actual impacts here. But I think in many ways it's actually problematic because I don't like when they catch on to things that they like being unpopular, because the Republican Party will not change their views because they are unpopular. They will just do them behind closed doors.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that because that is, I think, what a lot of people miss, right? Is that it's unfortunately happening regardless. But I do want to say, like, I think that the people who do recognize that can start to feel a little bit hopeless because it's like, okay, the Supreme Court is kind of just acting in bad faith all the time. Stuff is happening behind closed doors anyway. We can't control stuff at the judicial level. So I would love your perspective on like, what is the silver lining here? Because I know that there is some stuff that you were sharing with me at the start of this call. Like, what should people be hopeful about and what are the avenues for change that perhaps the general public isn't necessarily seeing as clearly as you are?
Yeah, I think that silver lining is a strong term. I would never try to tell anyone that we're in it's not a silver lining, but what I've been saying to people a lot, I've been thinking there's this Antonio Gramsci quote that you may have seen on social that basically says like they wrote while he was in prison, in a Mussolini prison, about how the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, now is the time of monsters. And whenever we learn about massive change to structures in society, it's almost always following a period of really deep turmoil. And the right has gotten us into this period of really deep turmoil. And I think something we have to be very careful about is assuming that just because it's the far right that got us into this space, that the outcomes have to be their policy agenda. And I think that Zoran has made a lot of people so energized for that exact moment is I think that people are starting to realize this is about deep dissatisfaction, and the right has figured that out and started channeling it earlier. But if the Democratic Party could get it together and stop running on like, we just want to go back to 2012, there's real possibility for transformative change here, right? Like the Hyde Amendment, there's the inability to fund abortion in many states with public funding or on Medicaid. All of these things were bad before Trump, and they all needed to change as well. And so I think that maybe that's not a silver lining, but it's just a frame that I'm often bringing.
So, you said if the Democratic Party, and I think I agree with you, like if the Democratic Party changes how they're doing things, it could be revolutionary. And I think it's the role of every one of us to keep pushing them in that direction, right? So I appreciate that perspective. Places that folks should be going to get more resources on these kinds of things, or like how to sort of stay in the fight in maybe untraditional ways.
I think absolutely. One of the things, and I know this is a very dissatisfying answer, I feel like I've prefaced several answers to you with this, but I think one of the areas where we're really struggling is with long-term transformative change and plans. And that's something the Republicans are very good at because they're patient in a way that it makes sense that we're not, because it feels so urgent to fix these things now because it is so urgent. It's ruining people's lives on a day-to-day basis right now. And so I think that when I come back and say, yes, there's lots of kind of long-term court reform plans that we need to be educated on, not because that's going to be what saves us from the current moment, but because if the type of grassroots action that we're seeing across the country is successful and we get this kind of galvanized version of the Democratic Party, we need to know what they are going to do. And there's a lot of organizations that are working on putting forth like court reform plans and outlining in reports, what could we do if we are in a position of federal power to shift the courts back and make them work for the people again. Because I think that the Supreme Court in particular is one of those areas where people feel so demoralized because it's lifetime appointments that it just feels like, we're going to throw our hands up because there's nothing that can be done. There's actually a lot that can be done with a motivated Congress. I think that we need to research and understand those things. So I would point to, there's this org called People's Parity Project, PARITY, that has done a number of reports on what changes to the judiciary could look like and how feasible they are, which is vary if we just acknowledge that we need transformative change. And I would, when you are reaching out to elected officials, I think especially people in blue states a lot of the time feel like, what do I even do at the federal level? Because I know my senator is going to vote against this bill. I know my congressperson is going to vote against this. Use this time to ask them what they're going to do about the courts. Make it clear that this is something that's important to non-attorneys and that you're paying attention to and that you want them to have a plan for.
That's a great point. Rachel, thank you so much for your expertise and your insightful perspective. I genuinely sometimes wonder if it's possible for me to see things in a different light, given how much time I spend thinking about this stuff. And I do think you actually were able to achieve that, especially on Clarence Thomas. Like, well done. Truly.
Well, thank you. And to be clear, strongly against.
Yeah. I know. I'm just grasping at straws.
Whatever we can get.
Yeah, frankly. Tell the people where they can find you online and beyond.
I am at Cohen, COHEN.489 on Instagram and TikTok. And then I also have a RachelCohenOfficial.com that has a newsletter sign up for a newsletter that will come someday, even if it has not yet.
Long-term strategic planning right here.
Exactly. There we go.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Women in America. While the Supreme Court continues to disappoint, as evidenced by their decisions on birthright citizenship and healthcare for trans minors, we need to think about this as a long game and get working on strategies to transform our futures. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your network, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources, follow us on social media at Gemma_Talks. See you next week.